Well, welcome everyone back to the seventh of 8 installments of this 2024 Grantwood Country Forum, graciously hosted by the Cedar Rapids Public Library and attended by you all. Uh, Everybody here is doing this it's a labor of love. They're donating their expertise and sharing their connections with each other. And so that has just been a joy. And it just keeps going on and on. I'm happy to report. Um, on tonight's program, we have this Sean Ulmer, Executive Director of the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art, and he is going to present to us some insights related to very early Grantwood experiences in his life and in the Cedar Rapids art scene. So that's exciting. Then we will also have a feature presentation by author historian Barbara Feller, and she's going to be focusing on one of the Grantwood places, and there are many. And this time it is related to the Shakespeare Garden in Cedar Rapids. So that's going to be fascinating. And then also, of course, we'll start out. I have an announcement to make, and then we'll have a factoid or two from Paul Jewell, author historian. We'll have news of the week from Joe Coffey, because Grantwood is always in the news, just doesn't go away. And we've got a short essay from Mark Armstrong, child of Grantwood country and writer, poetry guy, gracing our presence here from Decorah/Springville. He splits his time a lot. So he's always dipping his toe into Grantwood country, just can't stay away. So that's fun. And so again, welcome you. I'm so glad you're here, and be sure to look at the Cedar Rapids Public Library's YouTube channel for past sessions of this series. This session will be recorded. Next week's session will be recorded and available for viewing for however long. So we're excited about that. And people are watching and enjoying them. And that's why one of the reasons we do this. So that's great. One announcement we have is the Iowa Poetry Association is currently right in the middle of their contest season. And you can go to their website, iowapoetry.com, I think it is. Anyway, this forum sponsors, this is the second year for our sponsorship of the Grantwood Poetry Prize. And that's open to Iowans. I'm sorry for people who live outside of Iowa. The Iowa Poetry Association is for Iowans. But what I love to be able to report this year is, as fate would have it, the judge assigned to judge our category is none other than the brand spanking new poet laureate of Iowa, Vince Gutierrez, former editor of the National Review up there at UNI, a well-renowned publication for many years. And he's got a resume just real long, as you imagine any poet laureate would have. So he's our judge. So if you have any questions about how that all works, feel free to email, and I'll be glad to pass on any contact information. And I know Barb Edler's here, and she's I believe, Barb, aren't you the secretary this year of the Iowa Poetry Association? I think, and she could also tell you some things. So there's that. And so I think I'm done with all that. Barb, oh yeah, there's Barb.
I had to walk away for a second. So what did you say? I just caught it at the tail end.
That's okay. I was just announcing that Vince Gutierrez, the new poet laureate, is the judge for the Grantwood Poetry Prize category for the Iowa Poetry Association contest this year.
Yeah. And you can find all the contest guidelines on the Iowa Poetry Association website, and the deadline's the 28th. So that's coming right up.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thank you, Barb. Appreciate that.
All
So
right,
that
sorry.
tie-in is, yeah,
Cool.
no, that's fine. That tie-in is fun. And by the way, speaking of all that sort of thing, if you feel compelled to write about anything related to Grant Wood, it will get published in the next Grant Wood Country Chronicle, which is a 2023-2024 publication. So the time is upon us. I would love to hear your insights, what you think, what you're inspired by. Don't be shy. If you need ideas, email me and want to do something, I can help find a road for you, or just go off on some Grant Wood related rabbit hole and let's see what happens. So thanks again for all of you who have been doing that and who will be doing that. Okay, I think we're ready for a factoid with Paul Jewell.
There'll be more than one factoid tonight. I've got several for you.
Oh, good, good.
You know, as I've researched Grant Wood over the years, I'm always drawn to the fact that there's a lot of commonality between my own life and Grant Wood's life. We were both originally from a farm. We went to a country school, etc. But there's another one that I found that I'm going to share with you today, and that was what Grant liked to put on his tomatoes and lettuce as he ate them. Well, the answer to that is sugar. He, rather than salt, he ate sugar on his lettuce and tomato, and also on his radishes and celery, he put butter, which is kind of an unusual, that one I hadn't heard of before. Another one is, according to one story, Grant was at an evangelical meeting, and the evangelist said that he was going to go to hell because he walked out a little early to do some chores. And that evangelical, is that right? Is that the way you would say it? That evangelical said, who was that? That was Billy Sunday. A third one, when
Can I
Grant,
interrupt? I have a great story to add to that.
well, add it.
When he said, "You're going to go to hell," Grant Wood said, "I've got to leave. I'm milking the Lord's cow," because he was milking the cow that belonged to the Lord family.
Well, I guess that was a holy cow.
It was the Lord's cow.
Another one is when Grant first started to make his lithographs, he borrowed old dental tools from his son-in-law, and he used those because they were so precise. And the final one was when Grant started to go out to Amana, sometimes he took along his mother Hattie, and what she really liked to buy when she was in Amana was goat's milk. And that's our factoids for today.
Thank you. Boy, I didn't realize we were going to get so religious with your factoids today. Oh, well, are you ready for the news, Joe?
Yes, and I must apologize. It's a light week for Grant Wood news. No new museum exhibition announcements, no painting or lithograph sales or auction announcements. Today's is simply the news that this is $3 off from Raygun, the famous "How much wood would Grant Wood grant if Grant Wood would grant wood?" I'm so lucky. My daughters got me this for Christmas last Christmas. But if they needed to go out and get it again, it's $3 off as of today. That's all I've got. 21 bucks at Raygun. There you have it. That's Grant Wood news for the week.
Thank you, Joe. See, but there's always something, isn't there? That's the point. There's always something.
That's right.
Oh, gosh. Well, hey, are you ready to lay an essay on us, Mark?
You bet. Let's rock and roll. So last week, Joe's program I thought it was very fascinating, talking about the music and the art. And I woke up at my normal time about 3:30 in the morning with all these thoughts rolling through my head and thought I should write them down. So here we go. It's called Music as Art. Bravo to Grant Wood for interpreting music as art. Some people can see music as colors. It's known as synesthesia. Hope I said that right. It's when one sense comes through as another. Was this what Grant Wood was trying to do? Music influences us all every day, even if we are not aware of it. It's there in the background, the soundtrack of our lives. It's said that cows give more milk listening to classical or country music versus rock or heavy metal. When we had cows, they enjoyed the country music. When Barbara plays her piano, I often close my eyes and imagine grabbing a note and just floating along as it lazily drifts. And as it fades, I grab another and continue the ride. She never had the opportunity to play for our cows, so I'm sure they would have enjoyed it. In my personal experience and my informal study of music and dementia, I found that music can touch the patient's mind, sometimes bringing them back for a bit. A toe might start tapping, or they just may sit up and start to sing. So why not interpret music as colors on a canvas? When Stone City was viewed with music, it brought out more details. Why? More of the brain was activated by the music. I think that it made the art more interesting. Imagine Death on Ridge Road with the Jaws theme playing in the background. Looking at Grant's work, I can almost see the notes floating along. I've been challenged by a friend to put one of his works to music. This should be an interesting experiment. That's all I've got. Thank you.
I could see it for a second.
Okay, can we hear? Okay. Am I interrupting you, Mark? Because my internet connection just went wonky. And I think I missed the last of your, so I
He
don't know
was-
what that'll do to,
He was over. He was finished, Elaine.
okay, and you
He
all
was
heard
finished.
him?
Yeah, we did. We-
Okay, good. It was just isolated to my connection then. I hope that doesn't affect the recording. Okay. We love technology for what it can do. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Mark, and we'll look forward to learning more about hearing your song or something down the road here. Yeah, and yeah, that opens up a whole other arm of things, and that'll be fun to visit that.
Yeah, it'll be a fun
That
experiment to see where that goes.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thanks again, Mark.
You
And
bet.
oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah, be sure to check the chat, Mark. So, Mr. Ulmer, welcome back again. It just wouldn't be a forum without you. We've grown very attached to getting the lay of the land from you directly.
Well, thank you. I do appreciate being invited back. So do you want me to go ahead and take it away then?
Oh, yeah. Are you ready to do yours, Mark?
I am
Sean?
indeed.
Well, great. Let's go. Go for it.
Well, thanks so much again for having me come back. I really do appreciate it. I enjoy my visits to the Grant Wood Country Forum. And I was really pleased when Elaine reached out to me and asked if I would be willing to come back again. And she also shared with me at that time that there seemed to be a lot of interest, a lot of presentations and talks that kind of dealt with Grant Wood and place. And so I thought, well, what could I do that might dovetail nicely with the kinds of things that have been presented and explored thus far. So I pulled together some images of works in our collection at the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art that look at place. There's lots of them, but I focus specifically on the earlier works because I think they tell us a lot about what Grant Wood was interested in early on in his career. And I thought it might also dovetail nicely with what Barb's going to be sharing with us regarding a work that he did with Marvin Cohen in the 20s. So I'm going to share my screen. Let's hope that technology works for us. Here. Okay, so can everybody see that and nod a head or two? Perfect. Thank you very much. So I just tentatively, at the last minute, threw a title slide on Grant Wood, Iowa, and through and through. And it sort of struck me, we talk about Grant Wood and we talk about how tight he was to Iowa, but that he had made these trips abroad. And so he was certainly aware of other art movements throughout the country and throughout the world. But it really was Iowa that spoke to him from the very beginning of his career. And so I think that, let's see if we can get this to advance here. Not getting it to move. Give me just a second here. There we go. All right. And it's just one of these quotes. He's known for a couple of quotes in particular, but this one was one that people oftentimes will mention to me, where he had said he had to go to France to appreciate Iowa. And I think, I think that was a very genuine expression on his part. But I've also heard from a lot of these same people that they take away from this quote that he didn't do anything Iowa oriented until he came back from France and from that trip in 1920. And that's simply not true. And so one of the things I wanted to do is share with you some of the things that he was interested in before that first trip to Paris in 1920, because it really does betray his interest, his lifelong interest in depicting the places around him. So I wanted to share with you a fairly early work, and these are certainly not going to be all of the early pieces. We have a lot of early pieces from his childhood in our collection and from his youth. But I wanted to share an earlier piece that was about a specific place. This is a Woodland Waterfall from 1906. This is came to us most recently in 2021. So in the midst of the pandemic, this piece came to us. It is a watercolor on paper. And I have not been able to identify the specific location of this, but it could very well have been somewhere along along Indian Creek. It could have been along the Cedar. It could have been along the Wapsipinicon. It could have been any number of places, but it has a certain specificity about it that really sort of that means that to me speaks of something that's not generic, something that is that he saw and he was very interested in capturing. He's a young man at this point, very early in his career. He's not a child, but he's a young man. This is 1906. And so he's out already kind of immersing himself in the surrounding environment and capturing what he sees. And then, of course, doing watercolors in particular is challenging, but doing watercolors of a waterfall is very challenging. And so he's not afraid, even at this young age, to take on something that is very, very challenging. This is not a very large piece. It's only a 5x8. It's a small piece on a very rigid piece of watercolor paper. It came to us framed, but we unframed it when it got to us because we weren't sure that it was really archivally framed. So I'm able to inspect the back. There's nothing on the back that tells us anything about the location of the work, and we have a pretty good provenance for the piece, how it kind of came through to us. But that doesn't tell us anything about where the piece might have been made. But it does feel like it had to have been made in this area, a landscape in this area, and challenged himself with trying to capture that, with that rushing water, the foaming water, the splashing water, to try and capture all of that in his watercolors. And many people don't associate watercolor with Grant Wood, but he actually did, especially in his youth, do quite a few works in watercolor. It's a very affordable medium. It's very portable as well. He could certainly take something like this out on site and do it if he so chose. It really is actually, even for a fairly youthful piece, really quite sophisticated. Beyond the water itself, he did a masterful job at capturing the boulders that frame the falling water, and then the leaves and on the trees are just incredible. They're really, really wonderful. He's already, I mean, we know he was an extremely talented artist from a very, very young age. He's already really quite sophisticated at this early point in his career. So we don't really know the precise location of this waterfall. He really hadn't traveled all that much yet in his life, and so it was probably likely that it was somewhere in the immediate area. Don't forget, a lot of our rivers today don't look like they did back in his time because they've been altered or dammed or something like that. So it would be very difficult to really isolate where this location was, but I feel very strongly it had to have been from the immediate area. This is also a fairly early piece. This is the old house with tree shadows, or the Dutchman's old house from 1916. So a good 10 years later. This is somewhat unusual in that it is on canvas. So early works on canvas are fairly rare. And of course, the place itself is not all that remarkable, but he betrays his fascination with light and shadow. He's really, really exploring how the shadow of that tree really kind of caresses and covers that that structure, the Dutchman's old house. I did a lot of looking in newspaper archives in hopes that I might find something that references the Dutchman's old house, but I was not able to find anything, unfortunately. But it is still a fairly youthful work. He's in his 20s. Or early 30s, and he's really sort of exploring working in oil on canvas. And I've got some wonderful details that you begin to see the actual texture of the canvas. So very thinly painted work, but again, he's really, really interested in the fall of the shadows on this structure. It takes a shadow and makes it so much more interesting when you kind of have it kind of bend across a structure like this. And he's really quite sophisticated already and working, on canvas, which is not an inexpensive thing for him, but he really is trying to position himself really as a painter as well. And remember, he began as a metalworker and was very interested in the crafts, the decorative arts, and then he kind of evolves into exploring painting as his primary medium. And so this is the fairly early oil on canvas from him. Again, a few more details here. Because I have access to the works, it's easy enough for me to go down and get some close-up shots so you can see how he's pushing paint around on the canvas. And unfortunately, this is probably a house that's here in Cedar Rapids or in the nearby areas. Of course, by this time he's lived in Cedar Rapids for a while, and he's in his 20s, and he's doing a lot of exploring. He loves to walk up and down Indian Creek, and he sees lots of interesting things along the creek. He begins his first paintings of Indian Creek in the next decade, but he is exploring some of the sites around he sees on these trips. So this could be a house in the environs of Indian Creek, in the Cedar Rapids, Marion area, or it could be. It seems like it's in a more natural setting, so it's probably not right smack dab in the middle of the city. But that would be my guess based on the movements we know he made at this time in his career. And here, again, a detail of his signature as well. But what I'm much more interested in is the way he's laying down paint, and how thin this is. And this changes. He becomes much more thickly applying paint in many of the works from around this time and the few years following. Here's one of those works from the following year. This is Feeding the Chickens, and it is set in Cedar Rapids. I know from a story that I've been told by somebody related to the girls in this picture. I don't have any concrete evidence or support of this, but the story is that Grant Wood went up and approached the woman in the house and asked her if he could paint her two daughters. And she was thrilled. And so he came back the next day and she had dressed them up in their Sunday bests, their beautiful Sunday dresses. And then he proceeded to take them and put them out in the chicken coop so that he could paint them. And so there's enough detail to that story that you think you could probably localize that to exactly where that happened. The mother was, of course, horrified that the girls in their best outfits were shoved into this chicken coop. But it's Grant Wood wanted a couple of figures in what he thought was more interesting was this depiction of the chicken coop. And you can see even in this shot, and I have details for you as well, how he's very interested in the play of light and shadow across the chicken coop. I mean, it really is, the subject of this is really light and shadow. It just happens to be on a chicken coop with chickens and a couple girls wearing their Sunday best. And I've got, a really nice detail here that shows how he's pushing paint around. You can see he's a little bit thicker than in the old Dutchman's house, or in the Dutchman's old house, excuse me. And you see they are overdressed for being in the chicken coop. There's just no two ways about that. But it's a wonderful story, and like I said, it has enough anecdotal detail that makes it quite believable. And you think there's that missing link is, well, where did that happen? Where's that specific place? But it's definitely happening, from all accounts, from everything I've been able to determine, it's happening here. He's depicting Iowa and being in Iowa, but in this case, really about the light and shadow falling across this chicken coop, basically. Here, a painting of horse traders from 1918. Now, I will admit I'm less familiar with the horse trading trade, but if you go down the rabbit hole, the Grant Wood rabbit hole, which we all do from time to time, you will find, if you do searches on newspaper archives, horse traders were a very big deal in the teens. There are countless stories in the Cedar Rapids Gazette and Republican about horse traders, and they weren't necessarily nice stories. Horse traders were talked about like people would talk about gypsies. Okay, they were considered to be untrustworthy. If there was anything that would turn up missing, they looked to the horse traders. It was, they were kind of put in that same category, probably unfairly, as other groups of people. But horse traders would pass through town, and they, mostly sort of out in the more rural edges of town, and that was a big thing. It was they were a migratory group, and they would move around, and they would move around in these wagons, and so Grant Wood felt that this was picture worthy. This was a slice of Iowa, and he was going to capture it in Oil on Board. And so he set about really in his impressionistic style, which is what he was working in at this time. He's capturing something that he can see, something, he's in Iowa and he's painting Iowa. When he goes to France, he paints France. When he comes back from France to Iowa, he paints Iowa again. He believes very much in painting what he can see. And so he could have stayed with French subject matter after he returned, but he really believed in depicting what he could see, what he could get his eyes on. and he was very interested. This was an interesting arrangement, composition of different shapes and forms. You got this nice sense of depth. You're kind of led back by way of a pathway, but you've got these different wagons, and you've got the shed, and these all of these really interesting geometric forms, all softened by his loose brushwork, but creating this really interesting overall composition. Again, I've got some nice details of his paint handling, of how he's sort of creating the structure for the composition. Remember, he's creating this really wonderful picture with just, sort of a liquid paint on board, and making it really quite readable, quite believable. And again, it really is a study of light and shade, and less of the dappling light that you see in some of his other compositions, but you get this really strong sense of very, very strong Iowa sun illuminating this particular scene. And here, just a close-up of the date. The exact location we don't know, but it's certainly to be in some rural area just outside of Cedar Rapids. Here, 3178, from 1918, another oil on panel. This is actually a painting of a house that he built with Paul Hansen. They built two identical arts and crafts style houses in what is now the Kenwood section of Cedar Rapids. First, the land was bought, and then they worked together to build these identical houses, basically from plans that one could find in a Craftsman magazine. It really is an arts and crafts style house. He and his mom and his sister lived in this shack on the property at first, without any running water and without any sophisticated sewage system, shall we say, and while they built this house, and we know, and it's named 3178 because that is the address of the house. This is 3178 Grove Court Southeast in Cedar Rapids, and it's still an address. It's kind of behind Raining Rose, in that section of the Kenwood section of Cedar Rapids, and so it is a very precise place, and he felt that this was a worthy scene of his time and of painting, oil painting, and you can see again it too is a study of light and shade. This particular work is on view currently at the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art if you wanted to see it in person. It's not quite as white as the previous screen. It's not quite as creamy as this one. It's sort of in between. But you can see that he, was there rendering all of this detail. I mean, think about how he's creating these three-dimensional forms, just out of pigment on panel here. But again, begin to see the dapple of light there along the door frame, and just the hint of the address on the door there, and just wonderful, beautiful, feathery, impressionistic brushstrokes. That you can see, again, just really, he doesn't need to outline every single leaf for you to know this is a leaf coming off of that tree, or these are leaves on the bushes that frame that front doorway. Wonderful amount of detail, not too much detail, so you're not bogged down in looking at every single outline of every single pane of every window, but you can read it as a window. He gives you the impression of what you're looking at, because when you look at something, you rarely look at it for an hour, detailing every single pane of every window. I mean, you're really glancing at something, and what he gives you is this wonderful impression, this wonderful glance of this house that he was not surprisingly very, very proud of, and because it was a labor of love. To build this house from this plan. Here, even closer detail where you could actually see closer than we would like you to get to the painting in the flesh. But a really good detail here, we can see how he's pushing the paint around on the surface. As I mentioned, the house still exists. Here's a write-up from the Gazette in 1943, and here's where it had changed hands. Grant Wood has already passed away. He was no longer in this house. Hadn't been for quite some time, but because he had gone to the studio, and then he had gone to Iowa City. But the house still existed, and here, it was still attached to Grant Wood's name, as you see here. Here they're just sort of, the Gazette wanted to report on sort of the change of ownership of this historical house. Now, not all of the house owners realize or appreciate its historical qualities, because that's what it looks like now. And it's a far cry from the way it looked when Grant Wood was there. Actually, Paul Hansen's house looks a little bit more like the original houses. But yeah, this sadly is how the house looks now. So it's not really worth a pilgrimage, I would say, but certainly seeing the painting of the house as they built it is worth a pilgrimage. Much more can be deduced from that than from this now 2-story aluminum or vinyl sided house at that address now. Here's the old Sexton's Place from the next year, from 1919. And it too is an interesting location. Have not been able to pinpoint it, but it was but there really wasn't anything in any of the newspaper archives or other places where I was searching, nothing in the files that told us much about it. Again, it's another subject that really is about light and shade. Look at the way the light is hitting the side of that sort of bump out on the white structure, the house. And it's all about how the light is being filtered through the tree. This wonderful tree, this somewhat willow-like tree, and all of the stuff that's sort of around, that sort of exists and lives in the outside, like chairs and pails and benches, and in the background, they're close to a cemetery or a family plot. So this is in all likelihood in the environs of Cedar Rapids. Probably out a little bit, but not too terribly far. Again, sort of a house that has a shed or barn structure adjacent to it, and either a cemetery or a family plot in the background, as you see there. Again, wonderful study of impressionistic brushwork in this painting, and it's very humble. It's a very humble subject matter. But it's very Iowa. I mean, is it uniquely Iowa? Probably not. This is a specific place, obviously. So in that way it is, but one can find these very humble abodes with barns and shed structures and family plots in any number of Midwestern locales. But Grant Wood found this arrangement interesting, and found it worthy of his time and his efforts to create this work. And it wasn't as if he had a ready market for this time. I mean, this is long before Grant Wood is uber famous nationally, and really somewhat before he's really well known and appreciated even locally. He's creating these works because he finds them interesting compositions for him to create. Elsewise, he would not be doing it. And so, it's again, it's not something that, a prominent businessman in Cedar Rapids would run out and want to buy necessarily. And that's not who he's making it for. He's making it for himself. He's very interested in the compositional elements, in the way these forms are all fitting together, and in particular in the effects of light and shade on the composition, on what he's seeing right before his eyes. He knows that in a moment's time, it will change. The light will change. The tree will move. The leaves will move. The tree won't move, but the leaves will move, and the light will change. on the structures. And again, just put down in this wonderful impressionistic style, but it's totally readable. He's even careful to get some of the shine, the reflection of the sun off of things like that blue pale, which just looked like a blob of white on blue in this detail, but when you step back from it, it reads totally as a blue pale. Now, the Old Stone Barn from 1919 is actually an identifiable location. That has been fairly well documented, actually. So this is a painting that he did in 1919. It was in an October 1919 exhibition where it was described as betraying Grant Wood's, quote, interest in the local environment. But we know more about it. I want to share with you a couple of details of it. Again, he's really interested in the fall of light and shadow on the compass, on the building in this case. There's a tree, but you don't see the leaves. Instead, you see the effect of the leaves on the stone. In this case, this is stone that was quarried or gathered from nearby Indian Creek, because this is a structure that was actually near Indian Creek. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second. But I wanted you to see some of the details of the work. And he's putting down this paint on this, and the brown that you see coming through is actually the board. It's actually the board coming through, and he's using that to kind of serve as the mortar for these stones. But again, it's really more a study of light and shade. You can see, again, wonderful detail work of the impressionistic style that he's employing. So this is the Old Stone Barn. It was a long-standing kind of pioneer landmark, always described as being on the Cedar Rapids Marion Boulevard. What they're talking about is First Avenue. That is the Cedar Rapids Marion Boulevard, is First Avenue in Cedar Rapids. In 1939, the barn is over 100 years old already, and it stands for a bit longer before it's eventually taken down. This says the early owners of the barns were the Lyons and Barkley. The builders unknown. Willard Harlan of Marion owned the barn at one time and operated a sawmill on Indian Creek. In 1875, the place was purchased by Henry Bennett, and that this was not only the subject of a painting by Grant Wood, but also by a watercolorist, Mrs. W.A. Montgomery, also did it as well, and I've seen images of that. The story behind it is kind of humorous. The barn eventually falls into the Anderson family, and Linda Anderson recounts the story of Grant Wood making this painting, and then offering to sell it to Mr. Anderson, Linda's grandfather, for, according to one account, $10, according to another account, $25. And Mr. Anderson said, well, anytime I want to see my barn, all I have to do is look out my back window. He was not interested in purchasing the painting. And that it came down to me verbally, but is also recorded in the Gazette as being the story kind of behind the painting, and that the owner of the barn himself was not interested in acquiring, sadly for him, the painting of the barn. But the barn was torn down eventually and became this Krebs Dutch Girl, as you see here, an ad for, I don't have a photograph of it, a restaurant, but then it becomes the Hardy Gardens for a good spell of time, especially in the 70s. and 80s. It was sort of a large garden area, not surprising because it was, there was also a house with the barn for a while, but it was the barn that survived. And so there was land, and so it would be perfect kind of location for a nursery, such as the Hardy Gardens, which occupied it after that. And then the gin mill took the place of the Hardy Gardens, so not your run of the mill bar, as they say, but of course, again, playing off the milling there that was there. But yeah, it was a sports bar, occupied the site at 3901 First Avenue. And today it is here. It is this structure, which you can still see today, and it serves as a service provider. It's a fairly less than exciting piece of architecture compared to the stone barn, I have to say, but it serves its current day function perfectly fine. For again, perhaps not worth a pilgrimage. It is, but it is. It's still very, very visible. It is really there, wedged between the Fairway and the Outback Steakhouse, and it's really. I don't know if my cursor will show, but it's really right about here, not far from the cemetery, but that's where that stone barn existed for approximately 150 years before it was taken down, and then became a series of subsequent different things. So again, this is not far from Indian Creek, which is where Grant Wood used to love to go, to haunt. It's not terribly far from the Kenwood section of Cedar Rapids. Indian Creek really, runs all the way, in Grant Wood's orbit from Marion all the way through Cedar Rapids and out the other side, basically. And Grant Wood knew it very well from walking it many, many times over and over again. Here, the cow path. So Grant Wood goes to France in 1920 and he comes back again. And so while my focus was really on the works that he did prior to going to France, and that where he was really interested in, it betrays his interest in Iowa and in sort of his immediate environs, goes to France and he paints a large number of really magnificent French pieces, French scenes in the impressionistic style. Comes back to Cedar Rapids in the 20s, and he starts to paint Iowa again. I think going away did put his fondness for Iowa in stark relief. I think he realized how much he liked Iowa. Paris was probably wonderful and exciting and great for 3 months, but he comes back, and it's what he knows. It's what he grew up with. It's what's around him all the time. And it really was about painting what he knew, what he felt comfortable with. So here at Cow Path, again, not a specific location that I was able to identify, but I wanted to kind of include it to sort of demonstrate how he returns to Iowa, and he returns to Iowan subject matter. This is a cow path that's near Indian Creek. From one newspaper account in the following year, 1923, it says most of Mr. Wood's paintings, as usual, are from the Indian Creek neighborhood. And it said you're talking about a different painting. They say very near the site of his cow path, which was bought by the Art Association, now the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art, last year. And so it is something that he that by accounts is near Indian Creek. From that same year, in an exhibition at the public library, which is where the Art Association was. It says one of his most recent paintings, The Cow Path, is an admirable example and is a favorite with all visitors at the galleries. He has expressed depth in the picture in an especially convincing and satisfying manner. The composition of the picture is also excellent and well considered. So while we've not been able to really identify with great specificity where this was, it does seem to be, again, in the environs of Indian Creek. And I have a few not super great details of him. You can see he's still very much working in the impressionistic style. I just love some of his feathery leaf treatment. So, and again, it's really about light and shade still. And even when his style changes, if you look at things in what we call his mature period, his mature phase, look at the lighting. The light is always critical in Grant Wood's paintings, always throughout. And then wanted to end with this piece, Van Antwerp Place from 1922-23, from just after the Cowpath. This is also one that was talked about in the newspaper accounts. A sketch liked by many is his Van Antwerp Place, a picture of a mellow old house held in the embrace of afternoon tree shadows. It shows a strong tendency of Mr. Wood's towards buildings that have been lived in long enough to take on a distinct personality. I thought that was very, very well put. Buildings that have lived long enough to take on a distinct personality. He sees something in these buildings. Yes, light and shade, very important, but he sees something in these buildings that's really worthy of his time and his efforts. Here, another newspaper article. Another Mr. Wood calls Van Antwerp's. It's an old house on the Mount Vernon Drive, which the average motorist passes without thought. So, of course, I was intrigued. Oh, Mount Vernon Drive. Okay. And we're talking Mount Vernon Road in Cedar Rapids. Surely we have some records of the Van Antwerp. Well, unfortunately, there were a lot of Van Antwerps in Cedar Rapids. This was not as uncommon a name as you might initially think. Many of them served in the First World War. They're documented in archives as being in the First World War. And they're coming home or being injured or having a car accident. I mean, all of these things, the Cedar Rapids Gazette or Gazette Republican or Evening Gazette has all kinds of little bits and pieces that they like to report upon. And many of them did concern with Van Antwerp's. But there is a Charles W. Van Antwerp who might be whose property this might be. He was listed as a gardener and listed as being on Mount Vernon Road at Memorial Drive. So really on the southeast section of Cedar Rapids. And it could be here. It could be this particular site because there's this sort of shed and there's a pot right outside of it. So it could be the trade of a gardener, but that is a bit of a stretch. I'll admit. But we know that it is somehow localized to Mount Vernon Drive today. And again, it's got we don't know exactly which Van Antwerp and exactly the address of where it was. But again, he's very much about sort of identifying these wonderful little places in Cedar Rapids. Here, a really lovely detail of how he likes to move paint around. That's just incredible. But it does have a level of specificity. It is, places very important to him, and they may not be grand places, but they're places that are distinctive to him. And so he feels that they are worthy of his attention and his talents in creating this. And I just want to close by sharing a newspaper article from 1936 in the Gazette, and it's really about Grant Wood, but it kind of comes full circle because it says Grant Wood, whose paintings of Iowa farm scenes have made him a leader of regional school of art. This, of course, is after American Gothic. Casually discloses that, quote, all the really good ideas I've ever had came to me while I was milking a cow. That's the other quote that he's particularly well known for. He said, Wood, departing for his home in Iowa City Wednesday night, because he's already in Iowa City at this point, said that he hoped to discourage imitators. He recalled meeting a group of French artists who believed a painter should wait for inspiration. Quote, "It was then I realized," he said, "that all the really good ideas I ever had came to me while I was milking a cow," end quote. His style of art was started as a revolt against abstract painting, he said, quote, "and I never paint typical scenes because I would have to leave out all the interesting individual details." Would recall that he once lived in Paris, quote, "grew a very spectacular beard that didn't match my face, and was convinced the Middle West was inhibited and barren." Quote, "But I came back," he said, "because I learned that French painting is very fine for the French people and not necessarily for us. And because I started out to analyze what it was I really knew, I found out it was Iowa." Thank you.
Oh, that was just lovely. Thank you so much, Sean.
Oh, you're welcome. How can you go wrong with Grant Wood, right?
Well, I know, but that was just so much. Everybody just does so much more than we expect, you know? Yeah, Marlis.
Sean, I don't know the date specifically of Grant's birth date. I know it was 1800s. When did he, in those early ones, like 1906, had he had training by then? How old was he?
No. He's largely self-taught. He
Well, I
really
know
is. Born
that's-
in 1892, so add
1880.
8 years on to everything, okay?
Yeah, okay.
So in 1906, he's really about 14.
Wow.
He's really quite talented from a young age. We have earlier pieces, I think dating from 03 or maybe 04. Very youthful pieces. He already has extraordinary talent. So no, he doesn't have formal training. He never really has a ton of formal training. He takes classes here and there, but he never graduated, from college with a degree in art or anything like that. He really is self-taught by and large, and extraordinarily talented for a self-taught artist.
Especially with the shadows, like you said, that shading, which even the best artists, and that is all just, I wondered how young he was. Thank you.
Oh, this is very exciting. And I know in the chat, I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for Barbara. So we are going to go late. Just so you know, we're going to linger. We are going to linger, Barbara. Oh, yes. So we're getting a double whammy tonight, people. And we're going to make hay through all aspects of this. So we want to circle back because we know that Steve Hankin has something to say about the two girls with the chicken house. He's got.
Let me get my pencil out.
Well, the story that I got came from a distant cousin who lives in Illinois, and her mother was a Heron. And one of her aunts, which would be this cousin's aunts, said it was her two daughters who were painted by Grant Wood. And she's the one that said that when he came back, she had them all decked out in her Sunday clothes and never expected that they would end up in the chicken yard. So it's a Heron, and I would imagine it's probably in Jones County and probably in Jackson Township, as far as I can tell. I don't know exactly where, but that's what I have.
How do you spell Heron?
That I couldn't tell you either. It might be double E.
Okay.
There are two different Herons in the neighborhood, so it's hard to say whether it's one or the other, but I can find that out.
What do you think, Dorothy? There are some herons in our world.
Yeah, usually it's Heeren. That's how I've seen it. But to Steve's point, there's probably a few variations, but that's what I see.
Yeah. I think that's probably correct.
Yeah, Steve has given me some of this information because I'm working on a project with it. Their names were Helen and Elda Heron, Herren. And in, looks like 2002, a woman in Anamosa was interviewed, and she said that they were her two older sisters. And I'll read to you what it says. She relates this story from her mother. Grant Wood was visiting his two uncles and an aunt who lived on the farm down the lane. Wood was born on the farm where the Herons lived. Wood's father died when Grant was 12 years old, and he and his mother moved to Cedar Rapids. During his visit, he called my mother and told her to dress my two older sisters, Helen and Elda, in their best, and he would paint them. Their picture feeding the chickens. Both the women in the print are now deceased, but if you want to look that up, it's in the Anamosa Journal Eureka of Thursday, August 2nd, 2002. And that'll give you the whole story, plus a picture of her holding the painting, feeding the chickens.
Perfect, great.
Don't you love it when stuff like this happens?
This group never ceases to amaze me with your connections. That was wonderful.
So keep thinking about Sean's presentation and any questions you might have. That was so wonderful, Sean. Thank you. I just kept looking at him like, okay, I've seen some of the pieces, but I was just blown away when you led with the piece that you got in 2021. So that was awesome. So thanks again. Barbara, oh my gosh. So we'll keep tying into the Cedar Rapids thing. And it'll be interesting to find out how old Grant Wood was when he was involved with all this, and all that. I'm intrigued to hear more. But this is Barbara Feller and her presentation related to the Cedar Rapids Shakespeare Garden. Let's hear what you got.
I'm going to try to keep it short.
Oh, well, you don't have to.
Well, all right. Can you hear me and can you see this?
Yes.
Great, great. Well, the Shakespeare Garden was founded in 1927, but it really dates back to 1895. That is the time that the Cedar Rapids Wednesday afternoon Shakespeare Club got started in 1895, and I joined it about 102 years later. And I'm still a member. And in fact, I read each time we meet twice a month. I read the minutes from meetings of the past. I try to either do like 100 years before our date, or I try to do something that's related to what we're studying. We study 2 Shakespeare plays each year, and people do reports on them. And what's happened is we've gotten to know these ladies, and we love them. And I'll be sharing a little bit about the Shakespeare Club and how the Shakespeare Garden came about. Okay. In 1895, it was the height of the women's movement of wanting to be liberated. The Civil War had brought about the freedom of slavery, and women thought, we should be free too. One of the things that happened with the group here, which got them started, is rather interesting, I thought. There was traveling through our country, Charles Dickens, and they wanted to go see him, but they weren't allowed in because they were women. And they were told, women should start forming their own clubs. You don't need to interfere with the men. I thought that was a rather interesting thing. So in 1879, the Ladies Literary Club started, and there were 2 of them in Iowa, one in, besides the Cedar Rapids, Dubuque and Muscatine. And, but the women wanted more. In 1900, women's colleges started being founded. And of course, as I mentioned last time I was on, Polk College started out as co-educational. The women were allowed to go to co-college right from the start in 1851. The background to when the Shakespeare Club was founded, there were 8 or 9 ladies who began reading books, and they wanted to study, and they decided that what they really wanted to do is read Shakespeare. Then Jenny Saylor was asked to be their leader. She had come to Cedar Rapids from Minneapolis, had been educated and a graduate of School of Elocution. She knew Shakespeare, had 2 little girls, was pregnant with another, but her mother insisted that she should lead this group, and lead she did. She was the leader of the Wednesday Shakespeare Club for 30 years, and many, many of our minutes include her. She was amazing. She helped the women in it learn about the characters. She made she was a very strict disciplinarian. We had all kinds of rules, which we still try to keep today. One of them is you're not supposed to have food. We do break that every once in a while. Another was you're not allowed to have handiwork, and you had to stand when you were giving something, and in those days you memorized your parts. And we've had, when I first started, women did not, and when I look up some of these ladies, you don't find out their first names, you find out their husband's name. I would be Mrs. Stephen Feller, and I was in our directory for many years, but then another gal and I, Katrina Garner, whose husband was the president of Cornell, and me, we decided we're going to ask these ladies, and we decided, yes, we voted, it's okay to use our first names in the directory. And it wasn't until I was secretary that I knew what people's first names were. It's just an amazing, amazing thing. And this started with this Jenny Saylor. In 1926, Mrs. Ella Tallman was president, and Mrs. J.J. Hall, who was a gardener, gave a report to the club on English gardens. She read Esther Singleton's book, The Shakespeare Garden, in 1926. And the quote is that we had years of wandering in our imaginations through Warwickshire, the Forest of Arden, and Anne Hathaway's gardens, sweet with fragrant breath of summer, pansies and violets, columbine and rosemaries, daisies, rue, flowers which seemed to belong to Shakespeare since they were all mentioned in his plays. Further inspiration came to the following, the members' attendance in a district convention of liberated women's clubs. And they had a presentation of 2 programs. This is also in 1926. What a Garden Club Can Do for a Community and Shakespeare Gardens. Those 2 programs sparked interest and support. The members were intrigued, and they decided that it was time to have a movement of self-improvement and voted to found a Shakespeare Garden right in Cedar Rapids. Where would it be? Well, here you see it. The city of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, gave the Cedar Rapids Shakespeare Club a little over an acre, and it's where we know right now, Ellis Park. And the first thing that they had a groundbreaking in 1927 on Arbor Day. And in 1928, the garden was laid out. And in 1931, they purchased a bronze bust by Louis Rubula, a French sculptor, and it's a copy of an original from 1750. And this replica cost $425. And believe me, that was a lot of money back then. It weighed 150 pounds. It was mounted on a pedestal of marble and given as a gift to the city from the Caston Product Company with a brass plate inscribed, presented by the Wednesday Shakespeare Club in honor of their leader, Mrs. Henry L. Saylor, they would call her Jenny, of course, March 23rd, 1931. And it was the very first sculpture ever in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. And it was a present to the mayor. This is the original design. They wanted to find somebody who could design the garden, and they found this person, Professor Elwood, who was the head of landscape architecture at Iowa State. And then they decided they wanted to have a nice entrance. And so who did they go to? They went to Marvin Cone, to Grant Wood, and they went to yes, his name just escaped me, and you know who he is, Ed Rowan. And they made the very first entrance. Now they were deciding that they were going to copy Anne Hathaway's cottage, which had thatched roofs and such. And they made a little rustic bridge that went over the creek, which became known as the Little Avon. And they did all this in 1932. Okay. Here are some early pictures. Here's a postcard that was sent to me from Paul Jewell, but via his friend Ben, who's going to be giving some presentations next week. Here are some other photographs from the past of the garden and some of the parts where Grant Wood and such. Now that entranceway and everything did not survive past 1950. The weather in Iowa does not do well for, or the weather did well, but it won the battle against thatched roofs. Here's a picture of Jenny Saylor, the first leader of the Cedar Rapids Shakespeare Club, looking at this bust of Shakespeare on the marble. In 1937, a pupil at Roosevelt High School designed a sundial, and he was assisted by Mr. E.J. Burns, who was supervisor of art in the city at that time. A lot of what I have read was written by a lady who was doing a presentation for me at the History Center when I worked there. And her name was Louise Ralston, and she was a longtime member of the Shakespeare Club. She has since passed away, but she made her report in such a way that it became very personal. And in 1950, she remembered going to Stratford-upon-Avon in England with her mother, and they took a lot of photographs and such. And by this point, this original entranceway designed by Grant Wood and Marvin Cone, etc., had been basically had to be torn down. So Mr. W.J. Brown creates a new entrance, and they add 15 feet of stone wall. This is a picture of Anne Hathaway's cottage. The first one would be back, that was from a postcard that was, I believe, 1928. It was around the time that they would have formed our garden. And this other one is much more modern picture. Obviously, the house is the same. And they don't have Shakespeare's actual house. I have had the opportunity to go on tour there because my husband did a lot of work at Warwick University, which is in the same area as Stratford. And the story is that Shakespeare, after he died, was still so popular that the man who lived in his house was getting sick and tired of people coming there all the time to look at it. And it ended up being destroyed because he just didn't want to have to deal with that anymore. So we see Anne Hathaway's cottage, but we do not see Shakespeare's birthplace. It's really kind of interesting. Let's see. Louise Ralston's mother came back, and believe it or not, she had to put up a big fight. And Louise said that she was embarrassed by her mother fighting, but she was really on her side. but she had to fight because they wanted to take the Shakespeare Garden away from Ellis Park and put in a baseball diamond. And I know maybe some people think that's a better thing, but they're managing now, I think, to have both. And she won, thankfully. She won her battle. Here's an entrance. Here's the entranceway. And they decided that they needed to add to the wall and such. And what they did was they had a lot of rummage sales. They used these rummage sales. This is the Shakespeare, the club. They did a lot of rummage sales and they worked with the city. We were praised in the New York Times because we were supposedly the only club, there were lots and lots of Shakespeare clubs in our country, but we were the only ones where the city and the club worked together to form a garden. And it is a beautiful garden. They wanted the flowers to be from Shakespeare's plays. They wanted the look of the garden to be the way it would look in England. And at the time, when it was at its height, 90% of the plants were things that were named in Shakespeare's plays. They added some more to the walls and such in the 1960s. In the 1970s, they started having more and more open houses for the public to be able to come there, and they did programs, had dances to Shakespearean style music. They put on some plays. They had the great group Demon and Bennett Dance Studio. In 1977, there was an article about Jefferson High School pupils reading from scripts. And in 1977, that was special because that was the 50th anniversary. But they decided, let's keep doing this. So they did. 1983, well, what I was going to say is what's written here is bad, but what the good thing was is that Dale Huddleston, who was from the city gardening, was working very closely. It's not his fault that this happened, but the bust was stolen and the sundial was vandalized. Both were found and both were repaired. And the original bust can be seen now in the Cedar Rapids Community Theater. And they have a replica that's put up in, and it's one of our members whose name escapes me, unfortunately, but she made the repairs on a bust that needed help. In 2008, of course, and in 2020, we had horrible weather events that brought a lot of damage to the garden. So before the derecho, there was a cooperative agreement formed by the Wednesday Shakespeare Club and the Northwest Neighborhood Association. And they are still very, very active together right now. They started out by trying to fix what had happened in the flooding. They decided that they had to kind of make it easier to take care of the garden. So they widened the pathways and changed a lot of the way it looked so British and everything. And they were putting in plants that could survive a lot better in our weather. But then we had the derecho, which destroyed 70% of the tree canopy in the Cedar Rapids area. And when I was visiting the Shakespeare Garden after the derecho, the first time I did this, I actually got lost because turning, I guess I drive by sight, not because I have any kind of a sense of direction or anything. I couldn't recognize the area. It was really, really sad, the number of trees that were piled up near there. But they are working very, very hard now. I was able to talk to Al Pearson from Pearson's florist shop, and he promised me a picture of a model that they have, but he forgot. But you can see this model if you go to Pearson's on the west side, and they are doing a lot of work. They are in phase 1 right now. this whole group started in 2018. He told me that they've ordered a new arbor made out of steel, that everything's going to be installed in the spring. And in July, they're going to be putting in bricks and pathways and taking care of it. This is what they think it's going to look like. They're going to put in a little mini theater so that people can come here. They're already having activities here in July. They're kind of related to the Freedom Festival time, but you can go here anytime to visit this garden. People get married here. And every once in a while we have musical events, and the Shakespeare Club itself still meets here. A lot of times, if a member passes away, we plant something in their honor, in their memory. And so we're still very active with working with this. And from our group, and here's Mrs. Saylor, and here's our modern group, kind of modern. I still had dark hair at the time this picture was taken, so it's before the pandemic. But our group, Sylvia Popelka and Barb Rame, and a couple of the other ladies are very, very active with this new renovation and revitalization. And so I'd like to thank them. I'd like to thank Ben Stahl for sending me some photos, Al Pearson, Paul Jewell for keeping us all together, and Jenny Saylor for listening to her mother. And I also thank the Wednesday Shakespeare Club and all of you for being so very supportive. Now, I don't know if you can see this. Whoops. Let's get back to, well, the address. It didn't show up on my screen, so it's 916 Ellis Boulevard Northwest. It's the Ellis Park, and you really should see it. It's kind of a hidden treasure of Iowa, and it's related to Grant Wood, so it's one of those places. Okay, I thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Boy, we've had quite an evening. And Sylvia, I'm so glad to see you popped in.
Oh, did she? Oh, I'm so glad, because
Yeah.
oh,
So,
great.
yeah, that's great to have you here for that. And so if
Barb?
anybody's got questions, let's just go.
Yeah, and ask Sylvia,
tell-
don't ask me.
Tell Barb that I'm sorry, today was my day with the grandchildren, and of course I left my phone at home, so I couldn't respond to you. And then I thought maybe they're still going, because I just got home a few minutes ago.
Oh,
So, but I'm sure it was marvelous, and thank you so much.
thank you for your assurances and your support. I'm going to tell everybody to direct their questions to you, because you know so much more than I do. If they have questions. Okay. go ahead.
Barbara, you did such a nice job. I'm eager to go and see the garden. I haven't been there recently, so I'd like to go. But Sylvia told me such an interesting story when we got together for coffee not long ago. Sylvia, will you talk a little bit about the thatch? The thatch? You're muted. Okay.
Okay, yes, I'd love to. This is a very, very cute and interesting story, but when they decided to do the thatched roof entry, and I can't put my hands right now on the picture, but the president of the club at that time was a Mrs. Hall, and her husband drove to Tama in his, and this is all from the minutes, in his brand new Ford car, and picked up, I think, maybe 80 bundles of oat straw or some kind of straw that could be used for the thatch. Now, of course, the first thing you think of is, why would this man take his brand new car and fill it with oat straw? Well, then you should see the picture of Mrs. Hall, because man, was she a looker. And I'll tell you, most husbands would have jumped at the chance to curry favor with that. But in the minutes, it's so funny how they recorded it, because they go on these little bird walks, and they were talking about how this rambling of Mr. Hall's could have been turned into a Shakespeare play. And it's just so funny. But yeah, so it was hand delivered by the husband of the president of the Shakespeare Club. I'll get out my notes sometime and email everybody these pictures of her, because she was quite a beauty, really. And
those were the same reeds out of the Iowa River that the Meskwaki made their wickiups out of. Is that right?
well, I'll have to look that up for sure, Paul, but it was thatch, so maybe that's what it was. But I'll revisit those minutes. Sometimes it's really hard, and I'm sure all of you who are really good researchers, I'm not, but all the minutes were handwritten. So sometimes you're guessing at what, even though it was maybe just 100 years ago, you're still guessing at what they were trying to say. And I have all sorts of information about how the community got behind the garden too. And it's very touching, because they had like bulb drives, and they would get like 100 bushels of daffodil bulbs that, people divide your spring bulbs. And there was such a support from the community for this garden. And if you think about it, and maybe Barbara already mentioned this, but this was just at the beginning of the Depression. So, people needed something to lift their spirits. And there wasn't an abundance of money, even though I think some of the families, the early Shakespearean members, probably had some deep pockets there. But for the most part, there was labor that was given by people in the community, and also then the city had their gardener working on it. Now that isn't happening these days, but it's just different times on that. And I don't know, Barb, were you able to get anything from that blueprint at all?
I did. I showed part of it. Yes.
Did you show part of
Yeah,
that?
yeah.
Yes, that's one of my treasures now. Oh, anyway, well.
Thank you so much for all the, I swear Sylvia did more work on this than I did. She was wonderful.
Well, thank you, Sylvia. Oh, goodness. Oh, my gosh. We've had so much. Any other thoughts related to either of our presentations?
One last thing, if people want to go to the garden, if we can work out a time, I would be very happy to meet people at the garden and, wander through and show and, talk about the different kinds of plants and bring my notebooks with then and now, because it's kind of fun to see that too.
Sylvia lived very close to the garden, so she is very attached to it and part of this neighborhood group.
Well, it's exciting to see all the plans for it. My goodness. So.
The one thing I can say about the gardens is, if you remember Grandpa Walt, he was a very well-known Shakespearean actor, and he started several English gardens. He came to Cedar Rapids one time and visited the garden and said that this was probably one of the best English gardens he'd come across in the States. So it must have been something, otherwise he wouldn't have said so. And it was in this, I think it was in the Cedar Rapids paper where that came out. I told Sylvia about it, so she's probably got it down on paper someplace.
And there was a New York Times article, as I said, where they were praising us as well. New York Times, not bad. Not the Cedar Rapids
Yeah.
instead, but it's.
Well, you had me at Grandpa Walton, so there you go. Yeah, there's interest in a garden tour. Have to time that when things are blooming somehow, some way.
I know that they're doing construction in July. They're going to do some major construction, but they're going to wait, which Stephanie Wager will be glad to hear, because she was concerned about it, because she's a musician, until after this concert, the community concert that they have. So they're waiting for that. So up through July, we can see it. And then there's going to be construction as they start phase 1.
Chris has a question.
The hall, is that any relationship to the Howard Hall in the mansion?
Did you hear her?
Yes, I heard, not that I have been able to put together. Yeah, but it's always possible that I've missed something. And one of the things I wanted to mention too, there was maybe Barb already said this, there was a compatriot of Grant Wood's that helped with the siting of the bust, which was in 1931, and getting that put in. And he was a man who did lots of ironwork, I guess, but he also is the man who designed the gates for Brucemore. When you mentioned the halls,
Right.
and of course his name is lost somewhere in space right now, but he
lasted 5 minutes. So
yeah.
doing
But anyway, there's, when you start looking into these things, you keep finding there's a connection here. And oh my gosh, it turns out this man was the uncle of somebody who did this, who was the sister of somebody who did this. And it's amazing to see all this interconnectedness in history.
I know the Hickox were very much involved in a lot of this, and that Ruby Kessler was an early member. So it's very possible that the Halls are part of that same family.
I do know one thing, that Mrs. Hall gave the club must have been in 1930, gave them $100 towards the bust. And that put them over the top for being able to buy the bust. And that was
very expensive.
Yeah, and that was significant. And there was a big thing in the minutes, underlines and stars and hooray. And that was the first piece of public statuary in Cedar Rapids. So there was a significance to that beyond just the bust of William there, but it was bringing art into public places. So that was also I think a really significant thing that happened, because it gave the idea that, well, this is a good thing, that we should have art in public places. So anyway, for that.
Another stretch here is that I think Howard Hall from Brucemore was originally from Onslow, Wyoming area of Jones County.
Yeah.
So there would be a connection between Grant Wood and Howard. We're stretching things a lot, I know, but it's interesting.
Yes, I had another question for Sean. Is when you saw the wagon, the picture of the horse wagon, the horse trader, it looked very much like the Stone City wagons to me. But, do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, these are very similar kinds of wagons. They're wagons that haul things, but also are wagons that you can live in. And I think that's what the horse traders used to be in as they moved around the country doing their, plying their trade. So yeah, I thought the same thing. It reminded me very much of the ice wagons in Stone City.
Sean?
Is that you, Carly? You cut out.
Sorry. Did Grant Wood leave any paintings in France? Are there wood works in any of the French museums?
No, no, and not to my knowledge. I mean, Garsh knows, Grant Wood work does appear, from time to time, including that waterfall that we got in 21. And we got a wonderful work, oil on paper that he did when he was in London. But no, I don't. They are lacking Grant Woods in Europe. Let's put it that way. He generally would bring things back. His market was here, and so he brought things back, and so many of them really did. I mean, although they're spread across the country here, the bulk of them are, and always will be, I think, in Iowa. And that was where his primary collectors were. They were the people who enabled him to become a full-time working artist in Iowa, in Cedar Rapids. So I don't know of any over there. They certainly do like to borrow them. Europe certainly does like to borrow Grant Wood, and they do from time to time. But no, I don't know of any that exist over there. But you never know. I mean, you'd have to be do a very exhaustive thing. I do know that there's discussion about doing a catalog raisonné of Grant Wood's work. I think it's years from happening. And I don't know, if there are those out there that I'm unaware of that might be over in Europe. The catalog raisonné, in theory, should contain everything that Grant Wood created. But I mean, things still keep appearing. We've gotten two works that were fairly unknown, at all in the last 2 years. So, so we're continuing to learn about what he's doing, his production. But I think that's largely because a lot of these things have remained in Iowa families for years and years. The watercolor, for example, was, believe, if I remember correctly, was gifted to a woman and her husband from Illinois who knew Grant and Nan. And then the husband found it in his deceased wife's papers, years later in the 60s when she passed away. And then, gave it to somebody who then eventually sold it at auction and stuff. So it found its way back to Iowa, to a local Iowa family that eventually then gifted it to the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art in 2021. That's a piece that nobody was tracking on because nobody knew it existed. So they are still coming to light, and we still learn more about Grant Wood as a result.
Thank you.
Neat. Oh, Debbie, you've got a question?
No, just a comment. So some of you know that Grant Wood's older brother Frank, was my great uncle by marriage. And Frank and Clara Wood had many original pieces of art. And one of them Grant did in Paris or in France called Café des Palais. And our family was before Frank and Clara passed away, it was gifted to my parents, and it was in our home for many years. And it's a beautiful piece of art. We didn't, after my parents passed, we didn't know who would get it in the family. So along with another one called A Lazy Afternoon that my aunt and uncle had, they were sold at auction. We never knew who ended up with them, but I'm hopeful someday I'll get to see them again in a museum. But we were very fortunate. Café des Palais, according to my Uncle Frank, and it's in the provenance of the painting, apparently was a famous place for a famous cafe. But the painting that he did that we had was more of a rural type of, Frank thought it was kind of a joke that he called the painting Café de Palais. But anyway, that's my little factoid, family factoid on French painting and what he did in France.
Oh, that's cool, Debbie.